Hi, my name is Eric Elliott. I'm the archivist here at the Moravian Archives in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
And I'm Diana Overby. I'm the Education Director at Historic Bethabra Park, also located in Winston-Salem.
I'm here today to talk about one of the most famous products ever to be produced by the Moravian Archives, and that's a book series that started way back in 1922 called Records of the Moravians in North Carolina. And in the next couple of video series, we're going to talk with different experts around the area about how they use records of the Moravians in North Carolina. Even though it's a 100-year-old text, it's still very valid for all sorts of uses, and you can find it right on our website. I'll show you how in a minute. Diana, wanted to just ask you, how is it that you came to be interested in Moravian history, and what is it that is your interest in Moravian history?
Well, I think I've been interested in Moravian history for about as long as I can remember. I was always interested in history as a kid. I went to 5 yesterdays at Old Salem and also completed their apprenticeship program. And I'm actually also descended from some Moravians. So I guess in some ways I feel like the history is in my DNA, so to speak. And since starting working at Bethabra 13 years ago, I really started getting into the story of the Moravians' first years in North Carolina, which I didn't know a whole lot about when I was a kid at Salem. I knew a lot about the Salem story, but not much about Bethabra's.
Very cool. Well, we're starting today with you talking about Volume 1 of what's now a 13-volume series. Volume 1 was produced with the help of the state of North Carolina back in 1922 by Adelaide Freeze, who was the first archivist of the Moravian Archives. It was an unpaid position back then. And what she did was translate a whole series of different documents, most of which were in German at the time, into English so that folks could get an insight into the life of the Moravian colony here in North Carolina. So just curious, what are the years and events mainly covered in your volume, Diana?
So Volume 1 covers 1752 to 1771. So it covers a lot. It covers Bishop Spangenberg's visit down to North Carolina to find the tract of land that would become the Wachovia tract. It covers the journey of the first 15 single brothers who came down to establish Bethabra in 1753. It also covers the establishment of Bethania in 1759 and Salem in 1766. So all of those major Moravian events are covered. And then in addition to that, we've got the French and Indian War and the regulator movement that takes place during those years. So a lot of stuff happening.
That sounds pretty exciting for stuff that's just sitting in our archive. Otherwise, that's a pretty good set of stories. Is there any particular, if I was trying to think about this in terms of story, is there any particular stories or protagonist in this? It's a volume that's 500 pages thick, and it's got all different kinds of source material in it, but there are narratives and stories there. Which ones stand out for you?
Gosh, there's so many, and that was it was really hard for me to narrow it down. As far as like protagonists go, of course, you've got those original 15 single brothers who came down, who had a variety of different skills, and they were able to use those skills to help, construct Bethabra and get that going. You've got Bishop Spangenberg. You also have Frederick Marshall, who was the architect and the planner, the town planner for Salem. He's in there a lot. Of the first 15 brethren that I was just talking about, you've got Dr. Colberland, who was one of the first trained physicians in the area. And we had a lot of non-Moravians that came to Bethabra just to see the doctor. In addition to that, you've got, as far as like main characters go, I always think about Anna Heinrich, who was the wife of Christian Heinrich. She came down with the first married couples in 1755, and she took over the married women's choir. And she also helped her husband with services and everything. So she was one of the first women that were there. Anna Johanna Kraus was the first baby that was born in Bethabra. She has a really interesting story because her mother died at a very young age, as did her father. And so she was basically an orphan that was raised by the Bethabra community. And eventually she was one of the first single sisters to live in the new single sisters house in Salem. So she's got a really interesting story. There's also Johann Samuel, and he was the first enslaved person that was purchased by the Moravian church. And he was also baptized during the consecration of the first Salem Gemeinsaal in 1771. So his name was originally Sam, and when he was baptized and became a Moravian, he became Johann Samuel. So a lot of different interesting people that are found in the records, and a variety of different people. As far as stories go, one of my favorite stories is about how when the first married couples came down to Bethabra, it was a very joyous celebration, and the single brothers actually climbed up to the top of their 3-story single brothers house, freshly built, and they were blasting the trumpets and welcome for the married couples who also had instruments with them, and they were playing back to them, and they were just so excited to see each other. I love that story because I think it shows that while there was a lot of adversity that they faced, there was also so much joy as well. So I love that story.
Given how much you hear and associate music with the Moravians, I thought that I could almost hear that over the hill, the battling trumpets, call and response between the group arriving and the group welcoming them to the area.
Yes.
That's very cool.
Yeah, exactly.
But now all these stories there's some that are from diaries like Spangenberg and I think Ed Vine, we might get some of his diary, but a lot of them are from the official diaries of the ministers who are writing down what's going on, right?
Right, yes. And I know that the first couple of years when it was just the single brothers, Brother Freeze, he was not the minister, but Brother Freeze was the one that took care of the diary, and he actually left in 1755 when the married couples arrived, so he gave over his diary duties at that point in time. So, but he was there for the first few years.
You've been around this text and Bethabra for a while now. In the text, what's an unusual fact about Moravian life you picked up from this work?
I think the most unusual fact is just how much they use the lot to make decisions. I always knew that they use the lot to decide about marriages and about like locations of settlements, such as like where to build Salem. I know they had to draw the lot several times in order to find the perfect right location for Salem. But I didn't realize how many other things the lot was used for. For instance, they used the lot to decide whether or not to purchase Johann Samuel. They were sort of split in their decision about whether or not they should own enslaved people, and the lot that they drew was for yes, and so that is why they purchased Sam. And in other instances that I can think of that they use the lot for, I know they used it to, when they built Bethania, they actually used the lot to decide when the new family should go and move to Bethania. They picked the date based off of that. And the lot also made a majorly important decision about the future of Bethabra, which I did not know about until I started reading through these records. But basically, the townspeople of Bethabra were like, Bethabra's pretty big now. We are on the map. People come and trade with us all the time. We're a major trade center at this point. Do we really still need to build Salem? What is the reason for this? Do we really need to do that? And that question went all the way to the directing board in Europe, who drew a lot. And the lot said, quote, "We are to tell our brethren in America that the Savior wills that Salem shall be the town in Wachovia for trades and professions, and they shall be moved thither from Bethabra. And that was from August 16th, 1765, page 324 of volume 1 of the records. So I had no idea that they were thinking about not building Salem and just leaving Bethabra as the major trade center. But obviously the lot made that decision, and therefore we have Salem today.
I think where I just remember the lot causing trouble between folks who wanted to get married, and the lot might say no or yes, but it's really had a much more important role for the community in these big decisions.
Yes.
That was important. The other thing I remember from, you talked about Dr. Colberland. I think for Colberland, and I know for Christian Gottlieb Reuter, that Adelaide Fries takes the time and does her little sketch, a graphical sketch that puts it in there with some additional things, because I think Colberland, what you mentioned earlier is true. Everybody in the neighborhood wanted that doctor. If they didn't come to him, they came and dragged him 60 miles away to a person in need.
Yes.
He was out there doing brain surgery in the hinterland as one of the few people who could have the surgical skills to help a fellow who was injured intentionally by axe in Davidson County, I recall, and he helped heal him up. But Adelaide Fries doesn't translate everything in the diary. She often uses excerpts. I remember at the beginning when they were talking about the Bethabra getting coined for a couple months, and how the workday is always framed by singing, a sing tune in the morning and something, and it goes on every day. And she says, after a couple months, okay, well, you get the idea. This is every day they're going to do this, so I'm not going to tell you every day, but I just wanted to give you a sample of things. It's really, really fascinating. But this is not just about Moravians in this book, even though it says record of the Moravians, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, the Moravians were visited by quite a few of their neighbors while they were there in Bethabra, and also in Bethania and Salem later. Really, the Moravians relied quite a bit on their neighbors those first years that they were there. There's record after record of them going to visit neighbors and purchasing food items that they didn't have yet, because they were busy trying to clear fields and grow crops and things, because they were an economic venture. So they were trying to find ways to make money, and their garden and things hadn't been put in yet. So those first couple of years were crucial as far as their survival, and I think a lot of that was because of their neighbors being so kind to give them some of what they had. And it looks like, they had a lot of positive interactions with their neighbors. During the French and Indian War, I know that a lot of their neighbors came to Bethabra as a refuge when Cherokee and Shawnee were attacking people who were settled along the Yadkin River. So, and out of that, actually, kind of because Bethabra got so crowded, they decided to build Bethania, and that town contained Moravians and non-Moravians living side by side, which was pretty unprecedented for the time, since most of the time Moravians liked only Moravians to be in their town, not non-Moravians. So while they had a lot of positive interactions with non-Moravians, they had some negative ones as well, especially during like the regulator movement. Basically, they had some people who came through that weren't the nicest, and I have a quote about that. One day, a group of regulators came to the mill, and they had a problem with Brother Cap, who is the mill runner there. They basically said to him that one of their friends had been cheated out of some of his grain. And Brother Cap, very calmly said, well, I didn't cheat you out of any of the grain that you had milled here. I happened to see your children who you sent to get this grain, feed their horse with it after they had gotten it from me. And then I also saw them go over to the Bethabra store, and while they were there, they traded some of your grain for sugar and other goodies. So Apparently the regulators were still kind of ready for a fight, but there were some other Moravians that were also in at the mill at the time, and because they were there, Brother Cap was safe. So they just kind of left in a huff. And a lot of times there were altercations and things in the tavern, where that was the place where non-Moravians could go for food and drink. And so, there were a lot of positive interactions, but there were some not so positive interactions as well.
I know there's so many names that are in this. There's lots of lists of who, I mean, we have a lot of people who are doing their family history who love this record series because it name drops all the families. There's lists that the official list are turning in of names. People can go check the index, and now because it's on our website, and you use a PDF and search for individual names. Sometimes that Adelaide priest didn't bother to put in the index. You can still find the names in the volume, which is very helpful. But
Yes.
if I was going to name drop for folks, any names? Are there any names in there that people who are Moravian might find an interest in? Any famous non-Moravians in your volume?
One of the most famous non-Moravians that's in Volume 1 is Governor Tryon. Lord Tryon, the man who lived in Tryon Palace that I'm sure a lot of people have visited before in Edenton, and even though that's reconstructed today, but he actually made 2 different visits to Bethabra. He came once in I believe it was 1767. This was after the French and Indian War, and he was interested to learn more about who the Moravians were. He was extremely impressed with their town building. He visited Bethabra, Bethania, and he also went to the town site of Salem, which was being built at the time. He was just super impressed with that. He loved their music. He attended several of their services, and he was also very impressed with their industriousness. And he ordered a ton of stuff from them to send back to where he lived. And I have a list of what he ordered. He ordered a windmill, 478 pounds of candles, 150 pounds of butter, 6 beehives, and a new gun. And the Moravians got that order together for him, and they took it down by wagon about a month later in October of that year. So he was extremely impressed with them. And then he came back again in 1771 at the end of the Regulator movement. And he put his troops in a field near Bethabra, and he actually set up his tent in the Bethabra Square. He had all of his meetings and meals in the Single Brothers house. And he told his soldiers when they got there, if any of them misbehaved in any way, there would be serious consequences, because he cared that much about the Moravians and what they had done for him in the past. So that was a very busy time for Bethabra. There were a lot of neighbors that came in. There were a lot of prisoners from the Regulator movement, but a lot of neighbors came and pledged allegiance to the king, to Governor Tryon, as this Regulator movement thing was wrapping up. So 2 different visits to Bethabra by Governor Tryon.
Very impressive. Yeah, what'd you learn about the way that the non-Moravians? How did they? What are the interactions? We're going to have this conference about Moravians and their neighbors. What can you learn something about the interaction of neighbors with Moravians in Volume 1?
Oh, I definitely think so. When the Moravians first arrived, one of the reasons they picked the site that they did was because it was kind of isolated. There was nobody living very close by. There was some trading routes that were nearby that the Cherokee used, but there weren't any white non-Moravians that were living very close by. And so they were very surprised when they just immediately began to get people visiting them, people who were either on their way to somewhere else, or people who actually wanted to come straight to Bethabra, again, to see the doctor in the early days, but then later to trade and that kind of thing. They got so crowded. I mean, they almost immediately needed to build a new house, because when they first got to Bethabra, there was just the Wagner cabin there, and they would let the neighbors or the passersby have their house, and they would sleep outside in the cold. And so very soon, one of the first things they did was build a new a sleeping quarter for strangers or non-Moravians to sleep in, and then they also started building a larger sleeping quarters for themselves, because they had so many non-Moravians that were coming through that they needed that extra space. So it's very interesting to see that, and to see how quickly how quickly the Moravians decided to start having English lessons. They started teaching English to the other single brothers because they were interacting with English-speaking people a lot. And they needed to know how to speak English in order to interact with them, to trade with them, and that sort of thing as well. So so there was a lot of interaction going on between Moravians and non-Moravians that I don't know that they originally had hoped for. And I think that as a result of that, that some of these non-Moravian influences did kind of infiltrate into the Moravian society.
Very interesting, I think. Yeah, there was a comment made in one of the diaries that we have all these visitors coming. So far, not many coming to ask us about religion, but most of us are coming for different needs and things. And I do think that changes things. Well, you're at Bethabra Park, which I guess, tell me a little bit about Bethabra Park and how this book series helps you in your work day to day.
Yeah, so Historic Bethabra Park is a really unique site, because we have a couple of original historic buildings dating back as far as 1782 with our Potter's House, and we also have our Gemeinhaus, which is the only one left in existence in North America, which was the church as well as the minister's living quarters that was built in 1788. And we also have our original distiller's house, which was built in 1802, and then the log house as well, which was built in the 1830s. But everything else is a result of Stan South's excavation and archaeology work in the 1960s. So we have a lot of foundations of where the original buildings were, the ones that I kind of spoke of earlier, like the Single Brothers House and the original Gemein House. So we have that. We have a reconstruction of the Palisade Fort that went up during the French and Indian War, exactly where the Palisade Fort was, because they found where those post holes were. And then as you move through the park, everything else has been reconstructed. So we have a reconstructed 1754 village, which was where the Moravians were hanging out during those first couple of years that they were there. Reconstructed community gardens and medicinal gardens. Dr. Colberland had the medicinal garden put in 1756. So all of those things are reconstructed, but they give you an idea of what life was like when the Moravians first arrived at Bethabra. And then as you go through the 1788 Gemeinhaus, you see what Bethabra was like after Salem was built and Bethabra was no longer a major trade center. And then in addition to that, we're also a 183-acre park. So we've got tons of trails that you can go on. We've got the Greenway where you can ride bikes. People love to picnic there, bring their dogs and go for walks there. We have the God's Acre up on the top of the hill that people can walk to and see graves dating back to 1757. So it's really, like I said, it's a very unique site. We have a lot of different things, a lot of different interests, I think, that would appeal to a lot of people.
We missed this year because of coronavirus an outdoor Easter sunrise service, which many people associate with Salem. But the first sunrise service for Moravians around here was in Bethabra, back on that hill over Monocacy Creek next to you guys. So it's very interesting. I really appreciate you taking a few minutes today to talk with us about your impressions of this work and to share a little about things. And also, I'll put in a plug that you all don't just interpret the Moravian experience there. You at Historic Bethabra Park have ongoing festivals and activities throughout the years and have a lot of school groups and public groups that come and use that place as well, don't you?
We sure do, yeah. So all the big special events we do still have some sort of tie-in to the Moravians. Like we have a big apple festival in the fall, though I'm not sure if we'll get to have it this fall, but the Moravians had an apple orchard. There's lots of records about them picking apples, about them preparing apples, drying apples. Apples that weren't pristine would go to the distillery to make apple cider, and that kind of thing. So there's a history of apples in Bethabra, and the Moravians enjoyed. So we kind of take that and sort of run with it with a festival that includes apple orchards coming and bringing their apples fresh from the trees, and then having vendors and music and entertainment. It's just a real fun time. So but we have several special events throughout the year, like you said. So we try to tie the modern with the past. And earlier you were asking me how those records helped me with that, and it helps me tremendously to see connections between what the Moravians experienced, and then how can we connect people today to those experiences.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for your good work out there, Diana, and thank you for talking to us today through how you at home might get more information out of this great Records of the Moravians or North Carolina book series started by Adelaide Freeze. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.